And it is time now for Canadians, in the course of our national evolution, to unfurl a flag that is truly distinctive and truly national in character.
He thought it was totally inappropriate for Canada to have what was really a hand-me-down, unofficial colonial flag.
What if I told you that Canada, the peaceful, polite neighbor to the north, owes its very existence to the bloodiest conflict on American soil? That the tranquil nation we know today was forged not by some grand idealistic vision, but by fear, by the very real, very terrifying shadow of a collapsing superpower right next door. For decades, we've been told a story, a neat, tidy narrative of how Canada slowly, peacefully evolved into its own nation. But that's not the full picture.
In 1867, Canada wasn't the vast land it is today. It all started with just 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia.
The truth is far more dramatic, far more American. Because to understand Canada, you first have to understand the chaos that nearly tore the United States apart. Imagine the mid-19th century. North America was a continent simmering with tension. To the south, the United States was a powder keg, ready to explode. The issue? Slavery. But it was more than just a moral debate. It was an economic chasm, a political battleground, and a cultural divide that ran deeper than any river or mountain range. The industrial North, with its burgeoning factories and free labor, stood in stark contrast to the agrarian South, whose entire economy was built on the backs of enslaved millions. Every new territory and every new law became a fight for control, a desperate struggle for power that threatened to rip the young republic apart. And just north of this impending catastrophe, a collection of disparate British colonies, not a nation, not yet, just a patchwork of provinces. The province of Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. They were economically disjointed, often squabbling amongst themselves, and militarily, well, let's just say they were vulnerable, very vulnerable. Their political systems were often in deadlock, making effective governance a constant struggle. They were, in essence, a tempting target, a rich prize waiting to be plucked by any powerful neighbor with expansionist ambitions. Britain, their colonial master, maintained a facade of neutrality as the American storm gathered. But make no mistake, their interests were deeply intertwined. British textile mills craved southern cotton. British merchants saw opportunities in both Union and Confederate trade. It was a delicate dance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of war. The irony, of course, was that the very conflict meant to tear one nation apart would, in a twisted turn of fate, become the unlikely midwife for another. A nation born not of shared ideals, but of shared fear. A nation born because of America's self-destruction. And that's where our story truly begins. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in 1861, igniting the American Civil War, the British North American colonies watched with a mixture of horror and apprehension. This wasn't just a distant conflict, it was happening on their doorstep. And very quickly, the war's ripple effects began to crash against their shores, forcing them to confront a terrifying reality. Consider the Trent Affair. In 1861, a U.S. Navy warship stopped a British mail packet, the HMS Trent, and forcibly removed 2 Confederate envoys. Britain was outraged. War seemed imminent. For a terrifying moment, British North America found itself caught in the crossfire, a potential battlefield between 2 global powers. The incident was diffused, but the message was clear. Their peace was fragile, their security an illusion. But it wasn't just diplomatic incidents. As the war raged, Confederate agents, spies, and sympathizers began operating from Canadian soil. They used it as a base for clandestine operations, a safe haven from Union forces. The most infamous example? The St. Albans Raid of 1864. Confederate raiders, launched from Quebec, attacked St. Albans, Vermont, robbing banks and setting fires. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was an act of war, executed from what was technically British territory. The Union was furious, threatening retaliation, even invasion. The colonies individually were powerless to stop it. And then there was the sheer, overwhelming might of the Union Army. By the war's end, it was one of the largest, most battle-hardened military forces the world had ever seen. What would happen when the war was over? Would this colossal force, fresh from victory, turn its gaze northward? The concept of manifest destiny, the belief in America's divinely ordained right to expand across the continent, was still very much alive. The fear of annexation, of being swallowed whole by their powerful neighbor, became a chilling reality for many in British North America. They were surrounded, exposed, and utterly unprepared. Britain, meanwhile, was growing weary. Defending these scattered colonies was expensive, a drain on imperial resources. The Civil War had highlighted the immense cost of maintaining a global empire, especially when facing a potential conflict with a resurgent United States. They began to subtly, and not so subtly, encourage their North American colonies to unite, to become self-sufficient, and to shoulder their own defense. It was a pragmatic decision, disguised as a benevolent push towards self-governance. But for the colonies, it was a stark ultimatum: unite or face the consequences alone. But the pressures didn't end with the war. In fact, they intensified, almost as if an unseen hand was orchestrating a series of events designed to push British North America into an inevitable union. The villain in this story wasn't a single person, but a confluence of forces, the lingering shadow of American power and the very real, very violent fury of a group of Irish-American veterans. First, the economic hammer fell. In 1866, the United States abrogated the Reciprocity Treaty, a free trade agreement that had been a lifeline for the British North American colonies. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a deliberate act, partly fueled by American resentment over perceived British sympathy for the Confederacy during the war. Suddenly, Canadian goods faced crippling tariffs, and their economies, already fragile, were thrown into disarray. It was a clear message: you're on your own, economically. This forced the colonies to look inward, to consider a unified domestic market as their only path to survival. But the most immediate and terrifying threat came from the Fenian Brotherhood. These were not just Irish nationalists. Many were battle-hardened veterans of the American Civil War, men who had fought for the Union, now fueled by a burning hatred for Britain and a desire to liberate Ireland. Their plan? Invade British North America, hold it hostage, and force Britain to grant Ireland independence. These were not disorganized rebels. They were trained soldiers, equipped with military tactics learned on the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam. From 1866 to 1871, the Fenians launched a series of cross-border raids into Canada. The Battle of Ridgeway in 1866 was particularly significant, where Canadian militia, poorly trained and equipped, suffered casualties against the Fenian invaders. These raids, though ultimately unsuccessful in their grand objective, were a brutal wake-up call. They exposed the utter inadequacy of the individual colonial defenses. A fragmented collection of militias was no match for a disciplined, battle-ready force. The message was undeniable: unite or be conquered. The Fenian raids weren't just random acts of violence. They were a direct, bloody consequence of the American Civil War, and they served as the ultimate catalyst for Confederation. And here's the twist: the very forces meant to destabilize British North America, the looming threat of American expansion, the economic isolation, the violent Fenian incursions, inadvertently became the strongest, most undeniable arguments for its unification. The villain in this story, the chaos and pressure emanating from the South, unknowingly became the midwife for a new nation. Figures like John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and George Brown, often hailed as the fathers of Confederation, weren't just visionary nation builders. They were pragmatists, astute politicians who seized upon the existential threats to push their agenda for union. The Charlottetown, Quebec, and London conferences weren't just polite discussions about shared futures. They were urgent, high-stakes negotiations driven by a profound sense of fear and necessity. The threat of American aggression and the very real Fenian raids provided the undeniable leverage needed to overcome colonial rivalries and political inertia. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act was passed, creating the Dominion of Canada. But this wasn't merely a natural evolution. It was a strategic consolidation, a defensive maneuver. It was a direct response to the chaos south of the border. The irony is profound. The American Civil War, a conflict that nearly destroyed one nation, directly led to the birth of another, specifically designed to resist the very forces unleashed by that conflict. Canada, in essence, was a geopolitical chess move, a buffer state, and a direct consequence of American internal strife. So, the next time you think of Canada, its vast, peaceful landscapes, its distinct identity, its reputation for politeness, remember its secret origin story. Remember that its tranquility was bought with the chaos of its neighbor, that its very existence was, in a profound and ironic way, a direct consequence of the American Civil War. Canada was not just born. It was forged in the crucible of American conflict. Its strong central government, its continued ties to the British Crown, and its very cautious approach to foreign policy all can be traced back to the lessons learned from those tumultuous years. It was a nation built on the principle of avoiding the mistakes of its southern neighbor. What if the Civil War hadn't happened? What if it had ended differently? Would Canada, as we know it, even exist? It's a chilling thought, a historical counterfactual that underscores the profound impact of that conflict. Canada stands today as a testament to unintended consequences, a nation born not just of vision, but of the very real threat of invasion, a desperate need for self-preservation. It's a secret origin story, hidden in plain sight, a reminder that sometimes the greatest creations emerge from the greatest chaos, and that the quiet, unassuming nation to the north has a far more dramatic, far more American beginning than most people realize.